Jabim, Lal Salam to everyone gathered. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Biju Matthew. I am with India Civil Watch International. On behalf of all of our members, the board, and my co-chair, Siddhisha Naidu, want to extend a warm welcome to everyone who's joined this meeting here today. India Civil Watch, for those of you who are running into it for the first time, we are a rights monitoring and advocacy organization located in North America, and we have been in existence in one form or another for close to 20 odd years, but have more recently scaled up, and this also marks the end of the first year of scaling up and doing an enormous amount of work around the question of fascism in India, and all of its associated and interlinked issues, from neoliberalism down to questions of the pandemic, etc. India Civil Watch is an organization that is member-driven, bottom-up in terms of the work that we do. We work in multiple work groups to get a lot of different things done, and this plenary is something that's extremely close and dear to our hearts, because Gail was a much loved and dear comrade to many, many of us who are part of India Civil Watch. Of course, we have the honor of having Bharat Patankar, Gail's wonderful daughter, as part of India Civil Watch's board and the leadership from the time we established ourselves as a scaled-up organization. We know how we've all been doing our best to huddle around Prachi through this difficult period. We know how, and for everyone who's felt the sheer difficulty, the pain of Gail's departure, we all know that Gail lives on, and this plenary is an attempt, our little bit that we are trying to add to that process of exploring and holding close to us all sorts of aspects of Gail's life, from her intellectual might to her political involvement and direct work, direct action, to the wonderful person in terms of the kind of person she was as she engaged many of us, to the world that she painted up for us in Bigampura. It's all so inspiring, and at the same time, at this moment, a moment of pain. But we are here to celebrate Gail's life, and we couldn't have a better set of people coming together to do that. Bharat, Chinnaiah, Geetha, and Yashica will spend the next hour engaging us on Gail's life. And again, on behalf of India Civil Watch, thank you for being here. It's not a plenary, it's a moment of coming together for many, many people who knew Gail so well in so many different ways. So once Chinnaiah, I'm handing the mic over to Chinnaiah to move the plenary forward. And once the plenary is over, we'll have Prachi coming in to do a small closing out. Thanks again. And Chinnaiah, all yours.
Jai Bhim, comrades, and thank you, Biju, for introducing this. And so, yeah, it's basically we are gathered here today to celebrate, Professor Gail Omvedt's legacy, particularly in terms of our contribution, in terms of intellectual and also political, and also the new imaginary of life for everyone, all the oppressed sections of society, particularly in India. And as a Dalit, and also as a historian, I have lot of debt to pay to her, and in terms of the way she inspired people like me to stand up, to come to this stage. Like when I was a student, like when we were looking for inspiration, when we were looking for the ways in which we would like to write histories and pursue intellectual endeavors, and we had very few people to inspire us, especially in late 80s and 90s when we were students in universities and trying to speak English words, and to see this people from America coming and talking about caste, and so this is a very interesting, in the sense, very inspiring moments for us, to people from other continents coming and showing interest in our lives. And in this context, it's a very I really feel it's a privilege that I can really commemorate her life and remember our inspiration in terms of the way she paid legacies for all of us. So in this context, to celebrate the life and legacy of Professor Gail Omvedt, and how she will, she will always be part of the Dalit ethic in India, whether we talk it or not. Like she'll always remain as part of this narrative of Dalit intellectual history, narrative of Dalit political assertion. So in this context, this is one of the ways in which I think, since it's our departure is very fresh to us, I think this is one of the ways in which we start commemorating and also remembering our work and making our work part of our lives. So in this context, I think, since I'm supposed to be the moderator of this event, and I will let everyone talk, and concluding remarks, again, I will talk about what I feel about our contribution in terms of anti-caste legacies and also Dalit studies in India. And shall we begin with Bharat Patankar, because he, as our partner and also fellow traveler, he had, we will listen to him for 8 minutes, and afterwards Geetha and Yashica, and then I will follow as I think now Prachi will be there. She will do after that, Bharat will. Prachi, all yours.
Yeah, Professor, actually, I believe we have to play a video to begin. So I will just share the video right now.
Sorry, you play the video, please.
On August 25th, anti-caste activist and academic Gail Omvedt passed away at the age of 80. Born in Minneapolis, US, Gail first came to India in the 1960s for a brief period. During this short academic journey, she was exposed to the caste oppression of Bahujan and Dalit communities. This journey left an impact on her, and she returned to India in 1970 for her PhD research on the non-Brahmin movement in Maharashtra. Her dissertation was later published as Cultural Revolt in a Colonial Society, the Non-Brahmin Movement in Western India from 1873 to 1930, and is recognized as a pioneering study in the field. Since then, she has contributed tremendously to the scholarship on caste, gender, and peasant movements from a sharp Ambedkarite and Buddhist perspective. Through her extensive work on the history of anti-caste movement, particularly in Maharashtra, Gail constantly foregrounded the dissenting voices from marginalized communities. In her obituary to Gail Omvedt, V. Geetha writes, Gail had also worked at identifying the historical markers of non-Brahmin and Dalit descent, beginning with Buddhism. Her writings on Mahatma Phule and the Satya Shodhak Samaj, on Baba Saheb Ambedkar's thought world, and on Dalit resistance, sketched in the contours of a rich world of protest and world-making. Omvedt has written over 25 books, including Understanding Caste, From Buddha to Ambedkar and Beyond, Dalits and the Democratic Revolution, Dr. Ambedkar and the Dalit Movement in Colonial India, Seeking Begumpura, The Social Vision of Anti-Caste Intellectuals, We Shall Smash This Prison, Indian Women in Struggle, and Land, Caste and Politics in Indian States. Even as she continued to write and contribute to the scholarly work on the issues of caste and Brahmanic hegemony, she was constantly involved with anti-caste movements, Dalit movements, farmers' movements, and women's movements on the ground. Gail moved to India permanently in 1978 and married Bharat Patankar, a Marxist, Buddhist, and an activist. She spent most of her life since then in Kasegaon, a village in Maharashtra. Along with Patankar, she co-founded the Shramik Mukti Dal, which has been actively organizing farmers and workers on issues of drought, dam, shrinking of commons because of development projects, and caste oppression in Maharashtra. Gail's scholarly work has been shaped and enriched through her participation on the ground, and as Uma Chakravarti succinctly puts, Gail managed to combine extraordinarily intense activism with an intensely engaged scholarly life, always in and around caste, patriarchy, and the deep divisions in Indian society. We need more activists and academics like Gail, who can combine the people's movements with scholarship to free the society of caste oppression and hegemony.
Thank you. So is Prachi going to say something?
I think I'm coming at the end, Chinnaiah.
Okay. I think then
Thank
we'll start with Bharat and then Geetha and Yashica, and then I will, before I speak, if you can talk. Now I'll give this, I will ask Bharat to say.
The host has muted you. You speak now.
Hello, should I start speaking?
Yes, please, Bharat. Thank you so much for coming and sharing, and we really appreciate. And please, you can start speaking whenever you're ready.
Can you hear me? Yeah.
First of all, I will thank the organizers for inviting me in this program and giving me an opportunity to express my emotions as well as my viewpoint about Gail's life. And Jai Bhim, Jai Jyoti, Jai Buddha to everybody. I will start with generation from which Gail and somewhat later my generation came in the movement. It was a period of late 1960s and early 70s, early 1970s. And I would say that it was a mad generation. Mad in the sense that people never thought about their future. People left their careers, people left their very IIT-like degrees and MAs and engineering and etc. Whatever degrees they had, postgraduate degrees they had, people joined the movements and became full-time activists in the movement in those days. In Europe as well as in the US and many other so-called third world countries, also that period was a period in which a young generation, which was at that time 25, 26 to 28 years old, 20 years old, and it was mad because not only because that they didn't care for their future, but mad also because they didn't think about the exact plan. They were not bothering whether they had exact plan of the revolution, exact plan of the changing the society, but they had a dream. And that was, I think, the most positive point with that generation was they had a dream. And that dream was creation of exploitationless society, ending gender exploitation, ending class and caste exploitation, ending the race exploitation, all these kinds of exploitation, gender exploitation. So the ending this exploitation and create a society which is going to be a different society of human liberation, liberated humanity. And that was a generation from which Gail came. And she was part of the movement when she joined Berkeley University. She was part of the anti-Vietnam War movement. She was part of the civil rights movement. She was going to the black people's localities and working along with them for the rights which they were struggling for. And she was also part of the newly emerging women's liberation movement in those days in the United States. Actually, I also didn't know about this, but Gail's closest friend, Virginia Grabiner, recently pointed out that she had gone to jail for 10 days and she was very happy that she went to jail, and coming back they garlanded her and that picture was with her. And she was very happy that not that she came out of the jail, but she was very happy that she participated in this movement. So, so that was the beginning of her participation. In the same way, when she came to India, she came in 1963 first to India on Fulbright scholarship and remained there at Nagpur for 1 year. And there she came to know about Maharashtra from the various friends which remained friends with her for whole life of her, who became my friends also afterwards. So she came to know about basically about Dr. Baba Ambedkar's movement, which she didn't know at that time. She came to know about Satyashodak movement, Truth Seekers movement of Jyotiba Phule, and also the non-Brahmin movement in Western India, basically Southern India and Western India. And when she went back and joined Berkeley University, and she decided afterwards that her PhD thesis would be on cultural revolt in Western India. And she came to India for that, for researching for that thesis and completing that thesis. What I think is that that was the reason actually we came together, because my family was my maternal side, my great-grandmother was a Warkari saint. She was going to Pandharpur, Vithoba's place, and she was conversant with all the saints, and she was widowed when she was 16 years old, and she had one child by that time. That is my grandmother. So she had a Tukova's Gatha, Tukova's book of songs, which is called as Abhangs, handwritten in a handwritten form. And surprisingly, she somehow, because of that, she came to know during this going on feet to Pandharpur, walking towards Pandharpur, and coming back walking to the village, that she she learned how to write and read, and she was acquainted with very many kinds of people and very many saints, what they said, and etc. So she knew by heart the songs of many saints. We still have that handwritten book in my uncle's home. So at the same time, our family also was staying in the place where now we were staying in same village and same house, somewhat improved. But it was situated near where the Satyashodak movement, Truth Seekers movement, was having a big center there. And a person who had written songs for Satyashodak movements, jalsas, or for the plays, also was staying nearby our house. So in that sense, our tradition also was Satyashodak movement, and Satyashodak movement was very strong in our area. In 1929, which Gail brought forward first, actually, during the research of this book, that nobody, after her, nobody has also concentrated on that and doing further research. That is very sad about it. But she pointed out that there was a big movement where rarely all the exploited castes come together. So there was a strike in quotes, that said that farming castes will not go and work as tenants on the jamindar's lands, on the landlord's land, and the land should be remaining fallow because they are not agreeing with the giving rights to the tenants over that land. Then all the other castes which had a religious binding as a part of the caste system, that some castes should cut the hair and cut the beards and shave the faces of men and etc. And some castes would wash the clothes, some castes would make the pots. So there was, as Baba Ambedkar said, that it is a graded hierarchy, and there was no way to go up and coming down of upper caste. So that kind of a situation was there, but all these castes came together and they refused to work for Brahmin jamindars, and also some Maratha jamindars who were opposing these people, and they said that it is their religious duty to do this work for us. So that was a very intense struggle which went on for 1.5 years. So Gail moved for that research as activist, I would say, and carrying academician in her heart, in her mind, but actually her movements and her going to the people was like a grassroots activist. And because of that, she reached every village, almost every village which was the center of this kind of a movement, all over Maharashtra, the Satyashodak movement in Maharashtra. And that is, I think that I also learned from that, and I think that that kind of a research, because of this attitude towards academic work, that we should be activists of academic work. So the practice and theory should come together even in research work. So this was not done by anybody, at least one doesn't know anybody doing it in India, and very few people are there who have done this kind of a research. Many people go on the basis of only documents and not going to the people, interviewing people. Her notes are still there. So that is one of the basic positive character which should be learned from her. I learned it from her because I was basically an activist, and I was secondarily because I loved to do the mass work. But when I started writing about theory, whatever Gail was doing helped me a lot. Taking my experience and converting it to the theoretical way. So this is one. Secondly, I think that Gail's whole attitude towards work and theory was basically loving people. not only loving the exploited people, but generally loving humanity. And it's her, she had her own way of doing it. I was part of one group called Magoa group, which was called as neo-Marxist group, sort. But we also were women's liberationists. We had friendship with the Dalit Panthers movement, and even if we were part of the Marxist framework, we had a traditional kind of a Marxist attitudes also remaining in us. That is why, instead, apart from I being a women's liberationist person, I had my male chauvinistic tendencies in my subconscious, and every male person has these tendencies in the subconscious, unless until one fights with it for long time. But when Gail, of course, we were intimate, and so Gail should have had big fights with me, but our fights were not because of that. She, in very loving way, she changed my attitudes. Actually, I came to understand that she was doing it, and I was getting improved kind of a attitude in my behaviors, my practice about women's liberation. So this made me more the intense companionship with her, having intense companionship with her. And I think whatever I am today and whatever lessening of the male chauvinistic, male domineering tendencies in me have reduced. That is because of her. I have become more woman. I say that I have become more woman than a man because of she doing work for changing me with her behavior, with her loving attitude and dialogues with me. I think her contribution also at the social level is not recognized in the form which I would say it should be recognized. One thing is that there was a big debate. There was a person named Comrade Sharad Patil who was in CPM, and he started a revolt in CPM that caste system should be also abolished, and caste system is a part of the basic structure of Indian society. And he was expelled from CPIM. So he was one person who was going through all these things, the fights. And at the same time, we were also doing anti-caste movement. But he was saying that the Phule and Ambedkar are philosophers. And our group people were saying that they were not philosophers. And most of the people, most of the communists, almost 99.9% communists were saying that they were stooges of British. They were pro-British people, both Ambedkar and Phule. And Gail fought this very strongly. And through the first book, she established that how the established left is wrong and how Phule was a philosopher, not only philosopher, but he had his a special theory of analyzing society. So he was a theoretician and philosopher both, and practitioner of the social change. And he put forward the viewpoint. He had the first person in Indian transformatory movement after Buddha who showed that he had alternatives, dream of alternative society. The same way she did about Buddha also. Buddha's aspect of reconstruction of the world, which Baba Sahib Ambedkar noted, that Buddha was not only philosopher, but Buddha and Marx, there were one common thing, that both of them said that philosophy will be not only interpreting the world, but it should be reconstructing the world. So she stressed this, that Buddha also was a philosopher, but his philosophy was taking people towards reconstruction of the world. And that is why, like D.D. Kosambi brought forward, he had a big role in elimination of the Dasa Shudra slavery in India in those days, 6th century BC and onwards. Same way about Baba Sahib Ambedkar. Baba Sahib Ambedkar was considered, also not considered as a philosopher or theoretician. But Gail pointed out that how he, in the annihilation of caste, he has put forward a very, very basic theory, or laid a foundation of basic theory of the caste system, and showed that caste is the part of the basic infrastructure of the society. And it is not just an ideology, this is not just a culture. And that
can I please remind you, other speakers
that
lined up? 1-2 minutes.
Capitalism and Brahminism are two main enemies of the people. They should be eliminated. So I think this is the contribution of Gail through her writings about these three big revolutionary people in India. And also she, from that viewpoint, Gail and myself, we used to say that we agree with Marx to the extent Baba Sahib Ambedkar and Mahatma Phule agree with Marx through their theory. So in that sense, Gail had a big contribution in sociology, academic sociology, and otherwise in generally a theoretical contribution for the societal change. Lastly, I would say that I'm going beyond my time. Lastly, I would say that Gail was, up to her end, she had forgotten some close friends also. She couldn't recognize them when they were not coming frequently during this last period. But she never forgot the songs. And we used to sing songs while she was very much not able to stand, etc. While eating, before eating. And just 10 days before that, before she left us, she sang with me, and she was the main person who sang, and I was behind her, saying, "Le mashale chal pade hain log mere gaon ke, ab andhera jeet lenge log mere gaon ke." And that was her heart, really. That was the inner self, which was alive with the movement, alive with the spirit of the movement. Thank you very much. I'm sorry for overstepping my time.
No. Thank you very much, Bharat. These are fascinating words, and we really appreciate your time and coming to share with us. And it's really, it's a great honor for her, and also privilege for us to listen to you. And now I think either Geetha or Yashica, whoever wants to go first, they can go.
Should I? Chinnaiah?
Yes, please.
I'm always very grateful for an occasion to remember and think along with Gail Omvedt. Personally, I learned a lot from her work at the time that I and Rajadurai started to work on the Tamil anti-caste and non-Brahmin movements. And before Gail had come along and written Cultural Revolt in a Colonial Society, there had been no major work of any consequence on anti-caste politics or anti-caste philosophies in late colonial and modern India. And Gail's work was singular in that respect. So for any of us who started researching anti-caste movements in our part of the world, her work was a very important precedent. And during the time we were working on the book, I also had the good fortune to meet her in person in Pune. And just as the book was completed and published, this was a time when she had started writing for the Hindu, and she visited Chennai a couple of times at the behest of the Hindu. And as was her wont, she wanted to meet with Dalit leaders and those who were writing about anti-caste issues, and some of us put together a small group to go and meet her. So she was very interested in Southern India and with all that was happening there. So we had the opportunity to engage with her on these questions as well. But basically, for me, what will always remain an enduring memory is her sense of humor, her love for different things, of music, for example. The one time I was on a road trip with her, she burst into song from time to time, recalling all the ditties of the 1960s in the United States. And it's so hard to focus on one aspect of her work without wanting to connecting it to every other aspect of her work. But for lack of time, and since we are all here to share and talk about her contributions, I shall restrict myself to just one aspect of her writings. But before that, I want to say that what is extremely enabling and attractive about her work is what she said about social science writing in the 1980s. I think in the 1970s, this was a piece that she wrote on participatory research. And in that essay, she made it clear that the work that she and some others were trying to do had to be judged both from the point of view of scholarly intent as well as political purpose. So engaged scholarship was something that should naturally lead one on from participatory research to being part of a movement. That's how she understood her own work in the 70s. And from what Bharat has told us, obviously she stayed with that thought for almost all her life. So today what I wish to do is to look at Gail as a theorist of the social totality, a concern that she never lost sight of. And it seems to me that her early work engaged with what at that time, back in the 1970s, was known as the unhappy marriage of Marxism and feminism. The title of an essay and later on a book by Heidi Hartman. This is something that Gail was also interested in. How does one understand this unhappy marriage between Marxism and feminism? And her thoughts in this respect deserve to be seen as a theoretical contribution in its own right. So like other feminist scholars of her time, Gail was critical of the socialist resolution of the women's question, while remaining committed to a historical materialist analysis. And even as she refused to dogmatize Marxist theory, she was convinced of the importance of theoretical abstraction. But she made clear that the terms of theory making, how we came up with theory, how we put concepts together, had to attend to history as it was lived, made, and experienced. And that theory making cannot only be faithful to the conceptual logic of dialectical materialism. This was something she stressed again and again in her early writings. With regard to feminism, she brought the same historical understanding to her engagement with the feminist question. And like other feminists of her time, she argued for the relative autonomy of the women's question. In other words, she said, you cannot read off the women's status in society from the so-called mode of production, that you cannot really think of it only in terms of how their condition was shaped by the material and economic circumstances of their time. And over a period, in fact, over the next decade, from the mid-70s to the 80s, she came to argue in a particularly sort of startling way that the production of goods, which is production, and the production of life, which is reproduction, need to be viewed in tandem and in the specific form of their interrelationship. And she went on to argue that social reproduction could, in certain circumstances, modify and determine the mode of production. So it was not simply that there's a mode of production and everything flows from it, but social reproduction as such could also modify and determine the mode of production. So this is something that she sort of spells out in an essay that she wrote, I think, in 1986, titled Patriarchy, where she sets out the basics of this argument. And she also points out that feminist theory, feminist reasoning on this subject has actually contributed to what she calls a development of historical materialism. In other words, one can't just end with Engels. Engels is a point of departure, but one has to actually take on board what feminists have to say about the reproduction of labor power and of the role of sexuality and ideology in securing that reproduction. So this, in a nutshell, was a theoretical approach to the social totality, so to speak. And it seems to me that her understanding of what feminist theory can do and what it had already done actually owed as much to her understanding of caste as it did to her varied readings in feminism. So in other words, her pointing to the importance of social reproduction, I think, stemmed from a very unique understanding of caste society. So even as she focused on, as many feminists of her time did, on women, women's work, domestic labor, subsistence economy, and so on, and she quotes a lot of these fellow feminists in her writings, Maria Myers, Heidi Hartman, and several others. But then she does something which none of them actually stayed to do in the Indian context. She went on to also link the entire sphere of social reproduction to the world of caste, which is something that I think has been unique to the anti-caste movement, so to speak. From Fule's time onwards, you see this theoretical move, that you cannot think of the world of production without simultaneously thinking of the world of reproduction. And I think for Gail, this was brought home not just in a theoretical sense by her readings or by what she had encountered of the Satyashodak movement. And Bharat has given us an extremely lived sense of what that time was like and how Gail came to know of the Satyashodak Samaj. But I think it also had to do with the kind of feminisms she encountered in India. And this is something that she writes about a great deal in We Will Smash This Prison, and in a number of other essays well into the 1990s. But basically, she's perhaps one of the few feminists, or perhaps almost the only one, who from very early on adopted a comparative approach. So it was not simply that you had feminism, you had liberal feminism, then you had socialist feminism, and then you had radical feminism. She didn't work with a template like that. Rather, from the beginning, she made it clear that feminisms in Asia, not just India, in Asia, and she was familiar with what was going on in Southeast Asia, for example, as she was following developments in Africa to an extent. And she knew that it was important to place the women's question in a comparative world context on the one hand, and also within India. So even though she was writing of developments from within Maharashtra, she never extrapolated from Maharashtra to the rest of India. Rather, she used her experience of whatever she came across in Maharashtra to try and see how she could understand comparable or different experiences in southern India, in parts of Bihar, in the Punjab, and so on. And she was really one of the very few people who followed and reviewed scholarship from across the different regions of India, for which many of us will remain eternally grateful, because I think one of the limits of early Indian feminist scholarship, it attempted to speak widely, though much of that experience was limited to certain geographies. And Gail was one of the earliest to sort of plot feminism along multiple geographies, though she remained focused on Maharashtra. And I think what this pointed out to her was the impossibility of theorizing social reproduction in a singular fashion, that it has to be always historical and attend to the details of geography as much as it did to history. And in fact, theoretically, she speaks in the essay on patriarchy of how in any theorization of the social totality, one has to look at three levels. And I think this is a very useful thing for all of us who teach, because I think she sets it out with such clarity. One is that, of course, the three levels that she identifies. One she calls the fundamental conceptual level, comprising tools of analysis for any society. And she says this is where you put things to do with mode of production, relationships of production, and so on. And then she talks about a specific mode of production like the capitalist mode or the feudal mode or whatever. The third level, she says, has to do with historically specific societies, or what she calls social formations. And it is from this context of talking about social formations that you actually breathe life into the conceptual level. In other words, you can't derive a social formation from a concept. You had to have a back and forth traffic between the social formation and the conceptual argument, mediated through this middle level of the mode of production. This is something that she sort of kept coming back to in a concrete sense in the various essays that she wrote throughout. And I think this is where caste became very important for her, because caste shaped social reproduction as well as production. And she was unwilling to say that this is primary and that is secondary. And in fact, she points out in any number of instances that the labor of reproduction is not only women's unwaged labor, not only the subsistent peasant economy that contributes to production, but also the shaping of that economy through the hierarchical and unequal logic of caste. So in other words, you cannot separate family, kinship, the social order and the economy. They are so entangled that you need to really establish with precision how they exist in any social context. So she pointed out that the totality has to be grasped.
That would be
Yeah,
good.
just a sec, just a couple of minutes. How the totality is shaped by the production of goods, the production of life, and the mediation really here is caste. And this is something that, and in concrete terms, she made us understand this through the kinds of struggles that she considered important. For example, the struggles of not just that shaped the peasant world, but also of the most marginal in the peasant world, Dalit agricultural laborers and single women and widows, who are the most marginal in the peasant agrarian order. So I think the back and forth thing that she did helped us see what she meant by theorizing caste as an aspect of social reproduction. And she also pointed out caste helps us see the social totality as both to do with production, with ordering labor relationships, and how these are in turn shaped by family and kinship, and how all of this is held together by a certain culture. And therefore, one needs to also engage with the affective, intimate, and cultural worlds as much as one engages with political economy. So one cannot say this is primary or this is secondary. And this brings me to the end of what I perhaps want us to think about, that what was very important, it seems, in terms of what Gail is saying from where we are today, especially in a context where, for many of you in the United States, this is something that you're perhaps familiar with. We're trying to read race and caste together in many significant ways. It's a very old exercise. It goes back to the early 20th century. But Gail's work is very interesting in this context because she suggests how caste can in fact be theorized as a universal category of oppression that allows us to grasp how a social formation actually functions. It is at once a form of social and sexual organization, as well as a shaping feature of production relationships. Caste allows us to think of women's work in the sphere of production and in the sphere of reproduction in ways that refuse the dichotomy of the base superstructure model, as well as the convoluted arguments that emerged in the 1970s, like Althusser, who talked of the economy being determinant in the last instance. For Gail, nothing could be termed determinant in the last instance unless you could historically establish that it indeed was so. Even it may be logically so, but historically that may not be the case. And I think what Gail helps us think is what holds the totality in place, not just the rule of property, surplus value, extractive rent, and modes of exploitation of waged and unwaged labor, but also the cultural, sexual, and affective ways in which these are rendered normal or rendered natural. In this sense, production and ideology, structure and consciousness are not separable at all and have to be understood as at once social and somatic, to do with the body that labors and the body which loves, or is refused love, or is refused touch. So in that sense, for Gail, class is always, everywhere, constantly shaped by caste. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Geetha. And now, Yashica, please.
Sure. Thank you so much, everybody. I just want to start by saying how deeply honored I feel to be here on this stage, where we've gathered to pay tribute and remember the legacy of Dr. Gail Omvedt with Dr. Patankar, Prachi, Geetha, and Professor Jangam. I never met Dr. Omvedt in person, a regret that will forever stay with me. But if today I'm able to understand how endemic casteism really works in Indian societies, convey my ideas with clarity, and assert myself with power, It is in large part because of the work of Dr. Gail Omvedt. I was first introduced to her work while working on coming out as Dalit. It was soon after I had asserted my Dalit identity in public and for the first time divorced the shame, both about my existence that was also entwined with my caste, that I was forced to grow up with. Reading the works of incredible Dalit authors, academics, and thinkers became a cornerstone for my research and a milestone in my personal journey. But it was the work of Dr. Gail Omvedt that truly shaped my ideas and how I would decide to write about them. The intricate layers of her ideas and the brilliance of her analysis, cocooned in the simplest, most accessible language, shattered every notion I had about academic writing. Gail, as we all know, was someone who was extremely approachable. For the article I wrote for the Foreign Policy magazine, I spoke to several of her friends, acquaintances, and former students. And nearly everyone commented on how she never talked down to anyone or asserted her stature as one of the foremost caste thinkers of modern India. The same access, availability, and the desire to make you feel included, which Dr. Omvedt practiced in her lived reality, also shines brightly through her work. As academics and writers, we know that language, words, and the way we choose to communicate them carry immense power. But what they also carry is the potential for gatekeeping. Complex verbosity and long-winded arguments that take forever to arrive at their destination are often rooted in oppressive class and caste structures and commonly used in academia to shut out those whose lives are most at stake by those ideas. This is a truth that we are finally beginning to wake up to. But Dr. Gail Omvedt was not only far ahead of her time, she also clearly understood why her ideas were vital to be understood by those for whom she was advocating. In life, Dr. Gail Omvedt fought for the agency of the marginalized, the displaced, and the caste oppressed, always passing the mic and insisting on their voices being heard first and the loudest. In her work, Dr. Gail Omvedt strived for the same direct manner and matter-of-factness, which made complex ideas seem easy to understand. In my foreign policy tribute for Dr. Omvedt, I had written, when Omvedt and Eleanor Zealot, before her arrived on the scene, Indian sociology and academia were overrun by nationalist academics who mostly ignored caste and framed an Orientalist Hindu idea of India as if that was the actual history of India. In the words of the acclaimed professor Surender S. Jodhka, who spoke this in an online tribute to Gail. Although Omved's early work focused on the ongoing women's rights movements in India, as Geetha just told us, it was mostly her work on Jyotirao Phule, a caste revolutionary from the 1800s, who, along with his wife Savitribai, established the first formal school for girls in India, and Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, the Dalit-born founding father of India's modern anti-caste movement and the architect of country's constitution, that gained her notoriety. Her work brought into sharp focus the intersections of caste hierarchy, class, gender, land ownership, and accessibility, and the environment at the same time. A remarkable achievement for an academic in the late 1970s and 1980s, when the concept of intersectionality was still on the distant margins of mainstream Western academia. In that era, almost all Indian-born academics were upper caste due to the deeply entrenched systemic caste discrimination that effectively barred Dalits from higher academia. Most of these academics thus viewed caste as a consensual system rather than one of forced submission and determined by birth, as we know Dr. Ambedkar has told us. As a result, that view erroneously and dangerously came to be generally accepted as the understanding of India around the world, a country that had deep class and gender issues, but where either caste didn't exist or it didn't make much of a difference. Omvedt challenge these caste-based and hierarchical ideas, not just by directly and incisively calling them out in her work, but also by bringing her organizational skills to the front lines of several peasant, feminist, anti-caste, trade union, and worker struggles in India. I spoke to Shailaja Park, who is an associate professor of history, women and gender studies, and sexuality at the University of Cincinnati, and one of the handful of Dalit academics in the United States, along with Professor Jangam, of course. She said, Gail did not sit in an ivory tower. She spent time learning from the lives and experiences of the people she was writing about. She said, when I was a student, there were few people writing about Indian history with a Dalit perspective. Her work is influential and revolutionary. Omvedt's decade-long engagement and friendships with Dalits, other lower caste Indians, Adivasis, which is the self-chosen name for Indian indigenous people, working class people, and farmers, combined with her razor-sharp acumen and sparkling moral clarity, made her a prominent and effective champion of Dalit and Adivasi rights. Yet, she made a point to center the leadership on those whose rights she was advocating for, a rarity in the celebrity-studded activist milieu of the 1980s and 1990s India. In the early 2000s, for instance, Gail Omvedt famously wrote an open letter to Booker Award-winning author Arundhati Roy, questioning Roy's criticism of the so-called big dams, a group of hydroelectricity and irrigation dams, which at the time were commissioned to be built on India's Narmada River and threatened to displace a population of the local Adivasi people. It was a part of Roy's advocacy work with the Narmada Bachao Andolan activist movement in India. Some of us grew up at the time or were old enough, probably remember, just speaking from my personal perspective, I do remember as Narmada Bachao Andolan being one of the most prominent activist movements of that time. And it was Gail who stood up to this widely held belief and had an extremely unpopular opinion at the time, where she questioned why there was no Adivasi leadership spearheading this movement, given that they were the ones who were being displaced, and argued that in fact the farmers in those areas needed those dams for agriculture. Her fierce advocacy for Dalits and other marginalized people led Dr. Gail Omvedt to be sidelined in Indian academia for decades. This is just from the experience of people that I've heard. Well, of course, Dr. Omvedt's contribution is humongous, and that is what we're here to discuss. But it's also worthy to know that many upper caste academics actively shut her out for speaking about caste. As we know, Professor Jangam is probably going to speak about this as well, when he has noted that in an article for this online publication called The Print, he wrote that as recently as the 1990s, anti-caste literature by Dr. Gail Omvedt and others was only accessible through underground Dalit networks in India. And as a Dalit student, which I'm sure he can reflect more on, he had struggled to find material that could validate his lived expression, his lived experience of caste oppression. For many Dalit academics, students, and writers, Gail Omvedt's radical transparency and anti-caste perspective became something of a refuge in the otherwise invalidating, oppressive, and silence-inducing culture of Indian academia. To this day, weeks and months after that, WhatsApp, Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube continue to brim with stories about her unassuming presence and approachable manner, and how she rarely pulled rank or talked down the multitude of Dalit, Adivasi, and other lower caste and marginalized students who crammed her lecture halls and seminar rooms for decades. Today, I just want to quickly end by saying, knowing and understanding that we have a limit on time here, as we have gathered here to honor the legacy of Dr. Gail Omvedt It is vital and important for us to remember her dream of anti-caste egalitarian utopia from seeking Begumpura. Dr. Gail Omvedt didn't just write on the margins, she lived in them. As the world is finally catching up to the ideas given by Dr. Gail Omvedt so effortlessly decades ago, her contribution will be remembered not just by the anti-caste movement, but academia at large across the world as among the most far-sighted, progressive thinkers of our generation who gave us a voice when we needed it the most. Thank you so much for having me here. Jai Bhim.
Thank you, Yashica. That's such a wonderful tribute. And yes, Prachi, you want to go or should I go and you want to conclude?
Whatever you think is best, Chinnaiah.
I think you should go then and I will conclude it.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Jai Bhim and Jai Savitri, to everybody here. This means a lot. Today marks 2 months since my mom passed away. So it is a special day. I'm, for lack of a better word, I count myself very lucky as a person to be born to such an incredible human being and another human being that's on this call, my dad. And then also my grandmother, who was a freedom fighter, a fierce feminist and anti-caste fighter of her time until her death in 2017. There is a lot of inspiration that I grew up with, and there is a lot writing on, what we should be doing to change the world. And, because of the contributions that my mom has made and what my parents have made and continue to make. My earliest memories have been on this, sitting on my mom's shoulders and my grandmother's shoulders during marches and rallies through rural and areas in Western India, singing activist songs. So when you're talking about songs, that's something that, my mom did till the very end, and, activist songs and having culture as part of movement work was something that she always believed in, and she was a true romantic and dreamer that way. So these traditions of Tukaram and Savitribai Phule and B.R. Ambedkar and their dreams and the dream of Begumpura was always something that was part of my everyday life. My dad brought up the photo that her really old friend shared, and it was about the photo of her coming out of jail after 10 days, and she was part of the anti-war movement. She was 26 at that time. That's when the photo was taken. She went to jail with about 40 people, who including Joan Baez and her mom and her sister, who were part of those 40 people. And she, that was what she was involved with, and so for her, the being against U.S. empire and militarism, being against its legacy of slavery and racism of the United States was a core part of what America was, and for her, what she needed to resist. And so when she came to India and she, focused her work on Dalit movements and anti-caste movements and against and for non-Brahmin movement work, that was what she brought forward, right? It was about similarly thinking how her work in the US was against patriarchy and militarism and racism. Therefore, it had to be that when she came to India, that the work that she would do there would be against caste system and would be against the Brahminical patriarchy and would be against the continued form of Indian nationalism. And so that's what she did throughout her life and focused her work on throughout her life. She wrote her, a lot of people have brought up the book, We Will Smash His Prison. It's one of the most inspiring books for many people. She wrote that when I was in her womb, and she published it when I was born, and she dedicated it to myself and my grandmother So, that book it's from a song, the We Will Smash His Prison is from a song called Ya Deshacha Bayana Aya Bahinina Sangaya Zayatsa Haiga Eki Karun Ani Ladha Pukarun Ya Turunga Podaitsa Haiga, which is basically saying that, we need to unite another woman in the movement is saying that, the only way that we can do this is to unite other women, and together we can fight this prison. And so she had the dream of another world. She had she always had a militancy, and so she always brought up those poems and songs that had the militancy of some of her favorite poems. From her early age was Bob Dylan and Joni Mitchell, who gave for her the inspiration in her youth. And then when it was in India, it was the Annabhau Sate, who was the Dalit poet and writer and a playwright who wrote a song that she always talked about, which was Jagbadal Ghaluni Gao Sanguni Gele Ama Bimarao. So he was basically saying that Baba Saheb Ambedkar told us that the only way to change this world is to put hammer it, right? And so that kind of militancy is what he wrote about. And so these were some of her favorite poems that she always brought forward in her kind of speeches, whether they were in academic world or whether they were in rallies, that she always brought these kind of examples to make those connections and really make the connection of that, whether it's through her book about We Will Smash His Prison, that many dominant caste feminists were talking about, women's movement didn't make, that the connection between caste and gender, to make the connection. She was always clear that Dalit people, the Dalit Bahujan people, have to be leaders, and Dalit women especially have to be the leaders. And if that's not possible, then it's really hard to win the struggle against Brahminical patriarchy. And she was also clear that it was important that other Bahujan castes and other dominant castes also have to refuse the shackles of caste system. It's like there's a T-shirt that I've seen in the U.S. that said, I used to be a white American, I gave it up in the interest of humanity. In the same way, the castes and other caste people, especially dominant caste people, have to truly give away their caste privilege and join the movements against caste annihilation with Dalit people in the leadership. And if that's not happening, it is really difficult for us to win the struggle. So she was always clear about that in her speeches. And so I think it's really important at this time to think about these particular things, because caste-based violence, especially against Dalit women, is growing and prevalent, and it's we've seen it in so many examples, whether it's the Hathras case or many different examples that we're seeing. And as we think about how we want to resist what is happening and the domination of not just dominant caste communities who used caste-based violence to suppress the resistance of Dalit communities to annihilate caste, but also the growing Hindutva that is destroying, whatever work that many anti-caste and people and freedom fighters who dreamt of a different India did. We're in a different place now, and if we need to really resist that, we need to think about what role caste plays in it, and caste and gender play in it. And these are the things that my mom brought forward in much of her work. And so that's what I'll say. Today, my mother really instilled in me the commitment to carry forward this legacy of the political work that linked caste and gender and class and racial justice. I really continue to, as I think about her and I think about her dreams, I always vow to carry forward this dream wherever I am, and throughout my lifetime, and really sharing this dream of Begumpura and accomplishing this dream of Begumpura together with many of you here and people in the struggle together. So thank you so much, Chinnaiah and others, and really great to hear all your thoughts about my mom and the work that we need to do.
Yes. Thank you, Prachi, for such wonderful recollection and also sharing with us the stories of your mother and also great intellectual and activist. And I just saw a note from Al, I think one of cousins of Gail. Is he here? He joined.
Yes, I'm here.
Yes. Do you want to say a few words and share something with us? You already sent something in the chat, but I thought everyone would be interested in seeing you and saying a few words, just for 1 minute or so.
Oh, sure. Just a minute. I knew Gail when we were young people, from childhood into our early 20s. Gail was a few years older than me, but I was a frequent visitor in the Omvedt home, and we lived nearby. We spent much time together, and I have very good memories of being with the Omvedts, Gail and Neil, and Dorothy and Jack, and what a great family they were. And all of them are now gone, so we mourn that. But I noted in my chat there that I was led at that time into the world of folk music, and I actually wound up writing a book, a folk song book, kind of a collection of many of the songs that were so popular during the 60s and early 70s, and sang them and recorded some of them. But as I was researching that book, Gail helped me by sharing a number of songs that she was familiar with and actually sang while she was attending Berkeley. She would come back to Minneapolis and visit with the family occasionally, and so it was always great to see her. What was so striking to me was when I first opened the Zoom call, and I'm sorry I missed the first 10 minutes, so I missed the video because of computer issues, just getting the Zoom up and running today. But so I'm hoping you'll rerun that at some point. But seeing Prachi was it just struck me immediately that she was my image of what I remember Gail looking like as we were growing up. And so it was a very striking, emotional moment for me, just to see Prachi. So thanks for the invitation.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that personal remembrance. And now I think, in the interest of the time, and I don't want to spend much of, talking about again, reiterating what has been said. But one thing I wanted to note, particularly the way in which Gail Omvedt entered into the Indian life, particularly as an academic activist and also as a feminist who believed in, building a new world, is that, the era of 1960s, as we remember, along with our participation in different, social movements. And also that was the era, 1960s is the era in which, Sanskrit and yoga-centric studies in America were flourishing, and ISKCON was becoming an, iconic movement, particularly in terms of attracting these white, Americans to join this so-called, spiritual Hinduism. So choosing the other way, particularly, the most, imagine if she would have pursued Sanskrit studies or become translator of some Sanskrit text, she would have been in, very different. But in that way, consciously choosing to stand with people who are oppressed and who are underprivileged is not an easy task in life, because, we understand what it means to, forego these sort of privileges. So in this context, I think, Gail Omvedt will be remembered precisely because of that choices she made, both intellectually and also in politically. And in that context, she is an inspiration for everyone precisely because of that. The possibilities they bring, the hope they bring, one doesn't have to be, unprivileged to fight for, unprivileged people, but even in privileged positions, one can sacrifice and stand. And that's what Prachi also emphasized, that, willingness to, sacrifice what you have for the better of humanity. So in this context, I think, she's going to inspire all of us precisely because of that, one can use one's privilege, whatever we have for the betterment of other people. So that is where the human being makes a difference. How they choose to help others or stand for the things which are better for the world at the cost of their own personal sacrifices. In that context, it's a great tribute, and thank you especially for, India Civil Watch for organizing this event, and particularly, thanks Bharat and also Prachi for coming, and our deepest condolences. But we celebrate, Omved's life every day. People like us, particularly, when we did not have any, anyone to inspire. I think, I remember first time encountering her in 1990s in Osman University and going and listening to her talk. Though I did not understand a single word of what she said, but I still remember, the hope she gave that, there are people who are interested in our histories, and, we can write. And those are the paths, I think, which basically, even if we don't say our works, particularly intellectual writings, are still an inspiration for all of us to pursue this further. And particularly the anti-caste legacies, and also to build a new world, casteless world, the true Begumpura. And thank you so much. And I will give this to ICWI organizers too.
Shall we close? There's been a suggestion if we should close with the song Le Mashale. I don't know if other folks know about it, but
you should lead us, Prachi.
Yeah.
Go for it.
Yes, Prachi, lead us to song.
Baba, do you want to join with the Le Mashale?
My microphone.
Money's there? Okay. All right, so let's do it. Le
mashale chal pade hain log mere gaँव के अब अंधेरा निकलेंगे लोग मेरे गाँव के बिन लड़े कुछ भी यहाँ मिलता नहीं ये जान कर अब लड़ाई लड़ रहे हैं लोग मेरे गाँव के ले मशाले चल पड़े हैं लोग मेरे गाँव के तेलंगाना जी उठेगा देश के हर गाँव में अब गुरिल्ले ही बनेंगे लोग मेरे गाँव के मशाले चल पड़े हैं लोग मेरे गाँव के नीक यारा जो सुबह लगती की आजकल लाल रंग उसमें भरेंगे लोग मेरे गाँव के लाल रंग उसमें भरेंगे लोग मेरे गाँव के ले मशाले चल पड़े हैं लोग मेरे गाँव के अब अंधेरा जीत लेंगे लोग मेरे गाँव के जय भीम लाल सलाम
Jai Bhim, La Salam.
Thank you all of you, and
Jai Bhim.
Prachi for this, and it's wonderful, and I really appreciate ICW event and celebrating the life of Dr. Omvedt. Raja.
Jai Bhim, Lal Salam, everybody. Thank you very much.
Bye bye.
We close the plenary with this. What a wonderful, inspiring
Thank
way
you.
to close it with Lama Shale.